Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into one of those journeys where history doesn't just feel like old names and dusty pages, but like a living, breathing soap opera. Full of scandal, obsession, madness, betrayal, and the kind of outrageous behavior that makes you wonder how half these people managed to stay in power for as long as they did. Before you get too cozy though, take a second to settle yourself in, maybe dim the lights, maybe put on that quiet fan in the background for some soft hum, and let your shoulders drop. This is your time to just relax, drift with the story, and let me do the heavy lifting as we wander through the... I always like to think of these nights as not just about storytelling, but about traveling together. You and me, we're stepping back into a world that feels familiar in some ways, but shockingly alien in others. We're heading into royal courts where rules didn't apply the way they do now, where the private lives of kings and queens weren't tucked away behind palace walls, but spilled right into politics, shaping wars, alliances, and sometimes even rewriting religion. The people at the top of the medieval food chain weren't always wise. What makes this even better is how close it all feels when you start to picture it. Imagine a great stone hall, flickering torchlight bouncing across tapestries, the smell of roasting meat mixed with sweat and damp wool, the scrape of boots on the floor. At the head of the table sits a king who can't keep his hands, or his eyes, to himself. Across the room, nobles watch, whispering nervously, knowing that what happens after dinner might change the fate of their families. That's not an exaggeration. That's how fragile life was when the crown sat on the head of someone unpredictable. But we're not going to rush. Tonight is 2 hours of letting the stories unfold the way bedtime tales do, slowly, warmly, with little details that let you sink deeper and deeper until it feels like you're right there in the room. I'll bring you along from one ruler to another, across countries and centuries, with each story flowing into the next like chapters in the same messy book. Now, before we get into names and dates, I want you to really think about this. The bedroom of a king was never just about the king. It was about power. Who shared his bed often ended up shaping laws, steering wars, or sparking revolutions. The pillow talk of medieval royalty could decide the fate of thousands. It's wild, isn't it? That something as personal as romance, or lust, in many cases, could ripple out to change. I know what you might be thinking: kings and queens having affairs or scandals. That's nothing new. But the thing about medieval rulers is that they had no privacy, no boundaries, and no limits on what they thought they could get away with. Imagine being able to lock someone in a tower just because you didn't like their attitude at breakfast. Imagine rearranging marriages like you're swapping chairs at a dinner party. That was their reality. And for everyone else around them, it was both terrifying and unavoidable. So here's how tonight is going to unfold. We'll meet the infamous King John of England, a man so scandalous he made barons rebel not over taxes, but because they were terrified to let him anywhere near their wives. We'll walk through the tragic, surreal reign of Charles VI of France, who genuinely believed he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment, all while ruling a country on the edge of collapse. Then there's Peter the Cruel of Castile, whose idea of But tonight's journey isn't just about kings and their scandals. We're also going to step sideways into the world of the Knights Templar, those warrior monks who started with vows of poverty and ended up running one of the most powerful financial networks the world had ever seen. We'll follow them from their humble beginnings in Jerusalem to their fiery, tragic end at the hands of a king who owed them too much money. Then, we'll wander into the story of Notre Dame, the heart of Paris, and watch it rise, fall, and rise again. All of these stories are connected by one thread: the idea that private lives can shape public history. Whether it's a king's desire, a knight's vow, or a pirate's cunning, the personal always bleeds into the political. That's what makes this night so compelling. We're not just learning about dates or treaties. We're peeking behind the curtains into the chambers and private worlds where history was actually. So as we settle in, take a breath. Let the day fall away. Maybe you're listening with headphones. Maybe you're stretched out in bed. Or maybe you've just dimmed the lights and curled up on the couch. Wherever you are, think of this as our little time capsule. 2 hours together, walking through medieval halls, sitting under the stars with pirates, watching cathedrals rise stone by stone. And remember, history doesn't always move in grand speeches or battles. Sometimes it moves in whispers, in stolen glances, in reckless choices. That's what tonight is about. The human side of power. Messy, flawed, unforgettable. So, let's start this journey together. First stop England. The year is 1199, and a man named John has just inherited the crown. He will soon prove himself to be not only one of the worst kings politically, but also one of the most scandalous men ever to hold the throne. But before we dive into his story, take one last moment to settle in. The night is young, the stories are rich, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. When you think of medieval kings, you probably imagine someone grand and majestic, a man standing tall in shining armor, sword raised high, inspiring loyalty in his people. King John of England was not that man. If anything, he was the kind of ruler who made his own barons double lock the bedroom doors before hosting him for dinner. He wasn't just bad at ruling. He was bad at being a guest, bad at being a friend, bad at being a husband, and most importantly, bad at separating his personal life from his politics. John inherited the throne in 1199, and right away, he started piling up disasters like they were trophies. Politically, he lost half of France. Militarily, he was outmaneuvered by just about everyone he faced. And personally, let's just say he had a reputation that could clear a room faster than the plague. This man was not known for charm. He was known for taking what he wanted, whenever he wanted it, and leaving chaos behind. And here's the thing: medieval chroniclers weren't exactly prudish. They glossed over plenty of messy details in history. They'd skip right past witch burnings, torture sessions, and floggings without blinking. But when it came to writing about John's behavior with women, even they felt uncomfortable. One described him as not temperate with women. Another said he did not abstain from wives and daughters. That's medieval shorthand for this guy made every gathering awkward, and no woman in the room was safe. John wasn't just unfaithful, he was predatory. He kidnapped noblewomen, locked them in castles, and used them for his own amusement until he got bored or decided to marry them off elsewhere. At one point, he had 30 mistresses on official record. 30. That's not passion. That's an HR nightmare. Even worse, he didn't just seduce women for fun. He used it as a weapon. If he wanted to weaken a noble family, he wouldn't storm their lands with an army. He'd go after the wife or the daughter, drive a wedge between husband and wife, and then, for good measure, slap the poor guy with double taxes. Efficient, if horribly twisted. Imagine being a baron in England at that time. You've sworn loyalty to your king, but you can't leave your wife alone in the same room with him. You can't even invite him over without worrying about who he's going to target next. One nobleman flat out refused to meet John unless his entire household was locked away first. That's not diplomacy, that's survival. And yet, John somehow thought he was irresistible. Letters he wrote show how deluded he was about his own appeal. But the truth is, most people despised him. His antics weren't just scandalous, they were destabilizing. The barons didn't rebel against him because of some noble cause or tax dispute alone. They rebelled because they were sick of his behavior, sick of the fear, and sick of a ruler who turned his court into a minefield of suspicion. This is where personal vice bled directly into politics. John's reckless appetites created so much distrust that it helped spark the First Barons' War. It wasn't just about heavy taxes or failed wars. It was about a king who couldn't keep his hands to himself. And that pressure is what eventually forced John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, one of the most important documents in history. Think about that for a second. One of the foundations of modern democracy exists partly because medieval nobles wanted a legal document to stop their king from crashing their family dinners. Picture the scene, it's a chilly June day at Runnymede. John, cornered by furious barons, is forced to sit down and sign away some of his unchecked power. And yes, taxes and land rights were on the table, but behind all that was years of personal humiliation, years of whispered gossip, years of broken families. His inability to control himself helped create the push for a system where even kings had limits. John didn't reign much longer after that. He died in 1216, leaving behind a kingdom in turmoil, a legacy of deep distrust, and quite possibly a trail of illegitimate children nobody wanted to talk about at court. He wasn't remembered as the worst monarch in history, but he was definitely the one you'd never, ever trust as a babysitter. So, our journey begins with him, the king who turned bedrooms into battlegrounds, who proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing about power isn't how you fight wars, but how you behave when the doors are closed. And if you think John was bad, just wait. Our next stop takes us to France, where a king believed he was literally made of glass. If King John was the kind of man who made people invent democracy just to keep him away from their families, Charles VI of France was the kind of king who made his courtiers invent excuses just to stay alive around him. His story is one of those rare times in history where you almost feel sorry for the guy almost. Because while his mind unraveled, his country did too. And the two became tangled in a way that left scars on France for generations. Charles took the throne in 1380 when he was just a boy, and for a while, things looked promising. He was young, handsome, and showed flashes of being a capable ruler. France was battered but still powerful, and people had hoped that this new king might stabilize things. But history had other plans. Slowly, Charles slipped into one of the strangest and saddest spirals any monarch has ever endured. It began with odd lapses, forgetting names, losing his temper at nothing, staring into space for hours. Then the episodes got darker. He lashed out violently, attacking his own men in sudden frenzies, and afterward he had no memory of what he'd done. At one point, he became convinced that he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He believed that if someone touched him too roughly, or if he stumbled, he might shatter into 1,000 pieces. He ordered his servants to wrap him in blankets and handle him like fragile pottery. Imagine a king, dressed not in armor, but bundled in cushions, afraid that a hug might kill him. Now, most rulers with that kind of delusion would have hidden away, maybe letting ministers run things quietly. But not Charles. Somehow, his life became an unbelievable mix of paranoia, scandal, and spectacle. While his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried desperately to keep the court running, Charles was slipping into a private world of fear. He refused to bathe at times, convinced that water would dissolve him. He ran screaming from mirrors, terrified of his own reflection. Yet he also carried on with a mistress, Odette de Champdivers, whom the court referred to as his comfort. That was medieval code for don't ask questions, just pretend this is normal. Odette's role was surreal. She brushed his hair, listened to his glass-inspired ramblings, and helped him put on multiple layers of padded clothing so he could sit safely without breaking. That's not a royal romance. It's more like a tragicomic play. But it was real. and it became part of the daily rhythm of the French court. Servants had to walk on eggshells, literally and figuratively, around a king who thought his body might splinter at any moment. And then there was the infamous party. If Charles's mental struggles weren't already bad enough, one night of reckless entertainment cemented his reign as a full-blown disaster. It was called the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. Charles and his friends decided it would be hilarious to dress up as wild men, covering themselves in costumes soaked in flammable pitch and feathers, and then dance around with torches. You already know where this is going. One torch got too close, and in seconds, several of them were engulfed in flames. The room turned into a firestorm. Nobles panicked. People screamed. Men burned alive right in front of the horrified guests. Charles barely escaped with his life, but his dignity went up in smoke that night. Think about that, the King of France, believing he's glass, throwing torch-lit costume parties that end in people being roasted alive. It sounds like a dark parody, but it was reality. And the French people, already struggling under the weight of war and taxes, had to watch their ruler dissolve into chaos. Despite his episodes, Charles fathered 12 children, which boggles the mind. Historians aren't quite sure how that worked logistically, but it did. His moments of lucidity were unpredictable. Sometimes he was capable of acting like a ruler, other times he was completely gone, lost in paranoia. The kingdom became ungovernable. Factions formed, nobles schemed, and civil war simmered. And when England launched new campaigns in the 100 Years' War, France was too divided to resist effectively. Charles's reign stretched on for over 40 years, but those decades were less about leadership and more about survival. France survived in spite of him, not because of him. His story is a reminder that sometimes the biggest threat to a kingdom isn't a foreign enemy. It's the fragility of the man sitting on the throne. When he finally died in 1422, his reign left behind devastation. His madness had cracked France as surely as he feared his body might crack, and the country was plunged deeper into chaos. He was remembered not as Charles the Capable, not as Charles the Strong, but as Charles the Mad, the king who thought he was glass. And yet his story isn't just sad, it's bizarrely human, because behind all the titles and ceremonies, he was just a man whose mind betrayed him, whose fears took on strange shapes, and whose private pains spilled out into the fate of a nation. So, from the unwanted dinner guest that was King John, we move to the fragile glass King of France. But our journey doesn't stop here. Next, we head south into Castile, where Peter the Cruel showed the world that love, jealousy, and vengeance could all blur together into a storm of obsession and blood. If Charles VI of France gave us tragedy wrapped in fragility, Peter of Castile gives us danger wrapped in obsession. His reign reads less like a royal chronicle and more like the script of a violent, messy drama where love, jealousy, and politics mix until you can't tell one from the other. Some called him Peter the Cruel, others, oddly enough, called him Peter the Just. And the truth is, both were right. It just depended on which side of his temper you ended up on. Peter ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369, and from the very start his love life and his politics were hopelessly tangled. He fell hard for a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla. Whether they were secretly married or just bound by obsession, no one can say for sure. But Peter acted like she was his one true love, even while his advisors arranged more official, politically convenient marriages. That was the custom back then. Marry for alliances, not for love. But Peter didn't play by those rules, and that's where the trouble began. Take his marriage to Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman. The wedding was supposed to cement ties between Castile and France, a big deal politically, except Peter locked Blanche in a castle after just 3 days and never let her out again. 3 days. She spent the rest of her life in captivity because Peter decided Maria was prettier, or maybe because he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Whatever the reason, it was the medieval equivalent of ghosting someone, except instead of ignoring their messages, he threw them in a dungeon. Maria, meanwhile, became the center of his world. Even when Peter was marrying other women, even when court politics demanded his attention, Maria remained his obsession. She bore him children, whispered in his ear, and after she died, Peter wept for days. Then, in one of the strangest moves of his reign, he ordered her declared his legitimate wife after the fact. Retroactively married, it was less about romance and more about rewriting history to justify what had already happened. But Peter's passions weren't tender, they were violent. He fell in love the way most men wage war, fiercely, recklessly, and with no thought for the collateral damage. One of his mistresses, Duwana, tried to leave him. She was later found in pieces, enemies at court, cousins with claims to the throne, even random nobles who crossed him. They all found themselves in dungeons or worse. Peter's reign wasn't just passionate, it was deadly. He would lounge with a lover on one balcony while watching executions from another. Imagine a king sipping wine as a man is dragged to his death below. That was Peter's idea of multitasking. This is why some chroniclers painted him as a romantic gone wrong, a man whose feelings burned too hot, too destructive. Others just called him a tyrant. But either way, his court became infamous for its mix of love affairs and vendettas. Every whispered rumor could spark a stabbing. Every sidelong glance might end in blood. Being around Peter was like living inside a powder keg, waiting for the spark. And yet, there was loyalty too. Those who benefited from his favor, those who stayed close to Maria, those who shared his passions. They called him Peter the Just. They said he punished enemies swiftly, defended his allies fiercely, and stood firm against rivals who would have torn the kingdom apart. Maybe to them, he was a strong king. But to everyone else, he was a man who blurred the line between ruler and predator, between love and cruelty. His end came, fittingly, at the hands of family. His half-brother, Henry of Trastmara, led a rebellion against him. The final confrontation came in 1369, when Henry personally killed Peter in a brutal fight. Chroniclers wrote it almost like poetic justice, the man who had spilled so much blood in the name of passion and vengeance finally cut down by his own brother. A family feud turned into a kingdom-shaking climax. Peter's legacy is messy because it mirrors who he was. To some, he was a tyrant who let obsession rule his heart and cruelty rule his hand. To others, he was a strong king, ruthless but fair, punishing enemies and rewarding loyalty. But for us, looking back, he's a reminder of how dangerous it can be when a ruler confuses love with possession and justice with revenge. If love is a battlefield, Peter the Cruel came armed with siege engines, and Castile paid the price. From his blood-soaked romances, our story moves back north to England, where another king found himself in trouble not for cruelty, but for affection. Edward II's downfall wasn't about violence against his lovers. It was about loving them too openly, too defiantly, and ignoring the storm that grew around him. If Peter the Cruel destroyed himself with violent passions, Edward II of England managed to unravel his kingdom with softer ones. His reign wasn't marked by wild executions or locked-away brides, but by his devotion to men he loved, his so-called favourites. And in medieval politics, where every marriage was a deal and every friendship could mean war, that kind of devotion was just as dangerous as cruelty. Edward inherited the throne in 1307, following his father Edward I, a man known as the Hammer of the Scots. His father was a warrior king, feared and respected, a man of iron will. But Edward VII, he was cut from a very different cloth. He loved music, pageantry, swimming, building things with his own hands, even hanging out with commoners. That made him personable, but it didn't make him the kind of King England expected. Worse, Edward's heart was already claimed, and not by his queen. Enter Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion and rumoured lover. Gaveston wasn't just a friend. He was Edward's confidant, his joy, his spark of happiness. And when Edward became king, he wasted no time elevating Piers to positions of enormous influence. He gave him estates, titles, and jewellery that made the rest of the nobility choke on their wine. At Edward's coronation, Piers reportedly wore clothes so lavish they upstaged the Queen herself. Picture the scene: nobles glaring in outrage, while the new king beams at his bedazzled best friend. That's not just scandalous, it's political suicide. The nobility couldn't stand Gaveston. They called him arrogant, greedy, a second king. And maybe he was. But to Edward, Piers was irreplaceable. When the barons forced him into exile, Edward sulked like a heartbroken teenager. Then, ignoring everyone's warnings, he brought Piers right back, as if the whole kingdom were just a stage for their reunion. Imagine castles turned into break-up and make-up theatres, complete with royal tantrums and noble fury. Eventually, the barons had enough. They captured Gaveston and executed him. To Edward, it was devastating. He grieved openly, publicly, like a man who had lost the love of his life. But grief didn't make him wiser. It just left space in his heart for another favourite. And that's when Hugh Despenser the Younger entered the picture. Compared to Gaveston, Hugh was worse, greedier, hungrier for power, and utterly ruthless. With Edward's backing, Hugh grabbed land, titles, and wealth, bullying nobles and humiliating anyone who stood in his way. His influence was so overwhelming that he even took Edward's children away from Queen Isabella, reducing her to a powerless, furious outsider. Now, Isabella wasn't just any queen. She was the daughter of the King of France, brought to England with the expectation that she'd strengthen ties between two great powers. Instead, she was sidelined, disrespected, and forced to watch as her husband showered all his attention on Hugh. And Isabella wasn't about to sit quietly in the corner. She turned from overlooked wife into something far more dangerous, a vengeful strategist. She allied herself with a powerful noble, Roger Mortimer, who also happened to become her lover. Together, they launched an invasion of England in 1326. The support for Edward had already crumbled. Years of favouritism, misrule, and Hugh's arrogance had poisoned the nobility against him. When Isabella's forces landed, barons and lords flocked to her side. Edward and Hugh were left scrambling, abandoned by allies who were tired of being ignored. Hugh Despenser was captured and executed in one of the most brutal spectacles of medieval justice. As for Edward, he was forced to abdicate, the first English king ever to be deposed by his own people. He was imprisoned, stripped of power, and left to fade into the background of the very kingdom he once ruled. His end remains shrouded in rumour, the most infamous being that he was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body. Historians still debate whether that story was propaganda, a metaphor, or a gruesome reality. Either way, it was a fittingly cruel rumour for a king whose downfall was tangled in scandal. Edward Ty's reign wasn't about military disasters, though he had those too, Bannockburn, anyone. It was about how passion blinded him to everything else. He loved fiercely, but he ignored the political cost. He treated the crown like a shield that could protect him from reality, and when reality came knocking, it took everything from him. If the Plantagenets had their own Netflix series, Edward's season would have been banned in half of Europe. It was that scandalous, that messy, that unforgettable. His story shows us the danger of ignoring balance, of letting love turn into obsession, and obsession turn into downfall. From the reckless hands of King John, to the fragile mind of Charles I, to the violent passions of Peter the Cruel, and now to Edward's misplaced loyalties, we've seen rulers destroy themselves in every possible way. But don't think the madness stops here, because next, we're about to take a whirlwind tour through several other monarchs who drank too much, schemed too much, or scared their subjects half to death, all while sitting on thrones they should never have had. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern: kings had a way of letting their personal chaos spill out into public life. But for every John, Charles, Peter, or Edward, there were plenty of others who turned royal courts into something between a circus and a cautionary tale. Some were drunkards, some were schemers, some were hopeless romantics gone wrong, and each one left behind a trail of stories that make you shake your head and laugh, even as you realize entire kingdoms were at stake. Let's start with Wenceslas of Bohemia. And no, not the good King Wenceslas from the Christmas Carol, That was his ancestor. This Wenceslas was anything but good. He technically held titles like King of the Romans and King of Bohemia in the late 14th century, but ruling wasn't really his passion. Drinking was. And not just a little casual mead after dinner. We're talking multi-day binges where important decisions were made between swigs of wine and half-slurred jokes. Wenceslas loved hosting wild drinking sessions that stretched on until nobody could stand straight. He turned court politics into a tavern fight. There are records of him storming through his own palace naked, except for a sword belt, insisting clothes were for cowards. Imagine receiving an official decree from your king, only he's delivering it with no pants on. That was life under Wenceslas. Debates in his court didn't end in agreements. They ended in brawls, table flips, and sometimes duels with breadsticks. If you were a noble hoping for serious governance, you had to pack a flask and a helmet just to survive a council meeting. His love life wasn't much better. Affairs with laundresses, barmaids, and noble wives weren't exactly scandalous at his court. They were practically part of the job description. Eventually, the Holy Roman Empire decided they'd had enough of this royal frat boy. They deposed him, officially citing idleness, negligence, and ignobility. That's a polite medieval way of saying, "You're drunk, useless, and please stop streaking through the castle." His own brother called him a failure. And yet, Wenceslas somehow managed to reign for decades in Bohemia, tolerated like a messy uncle who drinks too much at weddings. His people rolled their eyes, poured another drink, and prayed he wouldn't pass out in the throne room again. Now let's cross the channel to England, where Henry V gave the world a whole new kind of royal drama. If Wenceslas was chaos through Henry was chaos through hormones. You probably already know the rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that simple little chant barely scratches the surface of Henry's mess. Henry's reign, from 1509 to 1547, was one long, turbulent soap opera. He wanted a male heir so badly that he bent the entire church to his will. When the Pope wouldn't annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry didn't back down. He just created a whole new church, the Church of England, so he could marry Anne Boleyn. That's not devotion. That's pettiness with a cathedral attached. Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Henry wasn't satisfied. He accused Anne of adultery, witchcraft, and basically anything else that would justify chopping off her head. And he did. His next wife, Jane Seymour, gave him the son he so desperately wanted, but died shortly after childbirth. Henry mourned, by which I mean he found another bride in about 11 days. The cycle kept spinning. Anne of Cleves, chosen from a flattering portrait, was dismissed as looking like a Flanders mare. Their marriage lasted 6 months. Catherine Howard, young and reckless, was executed for adultery. Finally, Catherine Parr outlasted him by being smart, careful, and very good at dodging accusations. By the end of his reign, Henry had eaten through wives, livestock, and England's treasury. His court was less a place of governance and more a reality show where the losers lost their heads. From England, let's sail north to Sweden for Erik XIV. Now he was a king with the looks of a Renaissance prince and the mind of a man teetering on the edge. Erik ruled from 1560 to 1568, and while he dabbled in poetry and astronomy, his paranoia ruled his court. He proposed to Queen Elizabeth, Eye of England, over and over again. She politely declined, then firmly, then with silence. Erik didn't take the hint. He even sent her portraits of himself, like a 16th century DM slide. Elizabeth ghosted him harder than she ghosted anyone else, and Erik sulked. Then came Karen Mundsdottir, a jailer's daughter. Erik fell in love, married her, and crowned her queen, scandalizing his nobles. They weren't upset about the romance. They were upset because Erik was unraveling. He started hearing voices, spying on his own council, and suspecting betrayal in every shadow. His paranoia climaxed at the infamous Sture murders, where he personally stabbed a nobleman during dinner. His courtiers watched in horror as their king, shaking with rage, turned a feast into a bloodbath. That was the breaking point. His nobles staged an intervention, by which I mean they locked him in a castle and handed the crown to his brother. Eric spent the rest of his life imprisoned, scribbling love poetry and ranting about conspiracies. Now, if Eric Xavier was paranoia with a crown, Ferdinand I of Naples was horror with a hobby. On the surface, Ferdinand looked like a strong ruler. He kept his kingdom stable, balanced the books, and kept enemies at bay. But beneath the polished image lurked one of the creepiest pastimes in royal history. When Ferdinand crushed a rebellion, he didn't just execute the traitors. He had their bodies embalmed and displayed in a private museum under his castle. He called it the Black Room. Imagine being a foreign ambassador, politely sipping wine, when your host says, "Want to see my collection?" Then he takes you downstairs and proudly points out traitors frozen in mid-scream, glassy eyes staring back. Ferdinand loved giving guided tours, describing each corpse by name and crime. It wasn't just grotesque, it was psychological warfare. On top of that, his personal life was anything but chaste. Mistresses' illegitimate children whispered scandals. He collected them as easily as he collected corpses. And yet, somehow, Ferdinand remained popular. His people admired his strength, his nobles feared him, and his enemies usually backed down after one peek into that macabre gallery. He ruled for decades and died in his bed, proving that sometimes fear really is the best policy. So in this little whirlwind, we've seen kings who drank their crowns away, kings who destroyed marriages with lust, kings who stabbed nobles mid-dinner, and kings who built their own house of horrors. Not every monarch shaped the world through wars or treaties. Some left their mark through sheer strangeness, and history, in its own darkly funny way, remembers them for it. But while these stories show us how wild monarchs could be, the chaos of kings wasn't the only force shaping the medieval world. There was another power rising at the same time. A brotherhood of warrior monks, men who took vows of poverty and chastity, yet became some of the richest and most feared figures in all of Europe. Next, we'll step out of the royal bedrooms and into the battlefield, where the Knights Templar carved their legend in blood, stone, and secrecy. Up to this point, we've been wandering through bedrooms, banquet halls, and royal scandals. But medieval history wasn't just about kings and their chaos. It was also about the men who fought in their name, or in God's name, depending on how you looked at it. And none were more famous or more mysterious than the Knights Templar. Their story begins in 1119 in Jerusalem. The First Crusade had just ended. Christian knights had seized the Holy City, and pilgrims from all over Europe began flocking there, desperate to walk in the footsteps of Christ. But outside the city walls, danger lurked. Bandits and raiders prowled the roads. Pilgrims were attacked, robbed, even killed. The Holy Land wasn't nearly as safe as people had hoped. That's when a small band of knights, just 9 of them, led by Hugues de Payens, made a vow. Not to a king, not to a lord, but to God. They swore to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, even if it meant giving their lives. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. That's a mouthful, so history shortened it to the Knights Templar. And here's the strange part, they weren't just soldiers. They were monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. No wives, no wealth, no glory. Just swords, horses, and faith. Their quarters were set up on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which gave them their name. Picture them, their warriors in white mantles, stitched with a red cross, living like beggars but fighting like lions. For the first 9 years, they stayed small and unofficial. They shared armor, sometimes even shared horses, but word about them started to spread. People marveled at this strange mix of monk and soldier, and soon, one of the most influential men of the time, Bernard of Clairvaux, a spiritual rock star in medieval Europe, threw his support behind them. He praised them as the new knighthood. Holy warriors who fought not for plunder but for God. With his blessing and papal approval, the Knights Templar became an official order, and almost overnight their reputation exploded. Donations poured in. Nobles gave them land, money, and supplies, young men abandoned lives of comfort to join them. And what had begun as 9 ragged knights grew into an army. The Templars were unlike anything Europe had seen before. They were bound by a strict code: never retreat unless outnumbered 3 to 1. No ransoms, no mercy. They trained daily, fought with terrifying discipline, and believed that dying in battle was the highest honor. To their enemies, they were devils in white mantles, charging with swords raised and eyes burning with conviction. To their allies, they were God's fury on horseback. But they weren't just warriors, they were builders. Across the Holy Land, the Templars constructed a web of castles and fortresses, stone giants that could withstand year-long sieges. These weren't decorative palaces, they were war machines made of limestone and sweat. Thick walls, hidden water channels, trap-filled gates. Even today, ruins of Templar castles stand as silent reminders of their skill. What made them terrifying wasn't just their swords, it was their discipline. Most knights in the Middle Ages fought for loot or personal glory. The Templars fought for an idea. They fought for the cross, and that kind of belief is far more dangerous than greed. It gave them an edge, a unity that shattered enemies who underestimated them. Now, it's important to remember the Templars weren't saints. They were still men, still capable of brutality, still caught up in the politics of their time. But their order was something new, a brotherhood that blurred the line between monastery and military camp. And for a while, it worked. They became the shock troops of Christendom, the hammer that kings called on when a battle needed turning. But power has a way of multiplying. What started as a vow of poverty and protection was about to turn into something much larger. The Templars were about to discover that their real strength wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in something far less glamorous, but far more enduring: money. Because while swords could win wars, gold could keep kingdoms alive, and the Templars, almost by accident, were about to become the most trusted bankers in medieval Europe. If the Knights Templar had only been warriors, their story might have ended with a few noble victories, a handful of castles, and maybe a footnote in history. But their greatest legacy didn't come from swinging swords. It came from something far quieter, far less dramatic. The irony is almost funny. These knights had taken vows of poverty, yet they went on to build one of the most powerful financial networks the medieval world had ever seen. Here's how it happened. Once the Templars gained papal approval, donations started pouring in. Nobles eager to show their piety handed over land, gold, livestock, and even whole villages. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land left gifts at Templar houses. Kings themselves trusted the knights with their wealth. The Templars didn't just hoard it, they managed it. Carefully, systematically, like accountants in chainmail. They built commanderies across Europe, fortified estates that worked like local branches of a bank. Farmers tended fields for them. Shepherds raised flocks. Everything was counted, recorded, and shipped where it was needed most. A sack of grain in England might feed Templar knights in Acre within months. A herd of sheep in France might end up clothing soldiers fighting in Jerusalem. Their reach stretched across continents, and for the first time, money moved through a truly international system. And then came their stroke of genius: letters of credit. Imagine you're a nobleman setting off on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Normally, you'd need to drag along a chest of coins, risk getting robbed on the road, and probably lose sleep every night worrying about thieves. But the Templars had a better idea. Deposit your money with them in Paris. In return, they'd hand you a coded letter. Travel across seas, across deserts, across dangerous lands, and when you arrived in Jerusalem, you could hand over that letter and withdraw your funds in local currency. It was one of the earliest forms of international banking, and it worked. Suddenly, travel became safer. Nobles, merchants, even monarchs started trusting the Templars with their wealth. They became the medieval version of Swiss banks. Centuries before Switzerland even existed, their financial power grew quickly. They safeguarded the French crown jewels. They loaned massive sums to kings, They managed papal finances. Imagine that, a group of monks in white mantles, answering only to the Pope, holding more control over money than most rulers dared dream of. That's the kind of power that makes people nervous. And yet, they didn't flaunt it. Their churches were plain. Their clothes were simple. No gold trim, no fancy banquets, no jeweled crowns. But beneath that modest exterior, their vaults were stacked with coins, their records meticulously kept, and their influence spreading into every corner of Europe. But power has a shadow. The more money they managed, the more whispers began. People said the Templars were greedy. Others claimed they dabbled in forbidden secrets, that their rituals were strange, their order too secretive. Envy and suspicion grew alongside their fortune. To kings drowning in debt, the Templars weren't just bankers. They were rivals, a state within a state, answerable to no one but the Pope. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, they held strong. They were warriors when called, bankers when needed, and a symbol of both faith and fear. But that mix, holy knights and ruthless financiers, wasn't sustainable forever. Because while they thought their discipline and devotion made them untouchable, one man was watching, calculating, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His name was Philip IV of France. History remembers him as Philip the Fair, not because of his sense of justice, but because of his good looks. Behind the handsome face was a bankrupt king, drowning in debt to the very order he pretended to admire. He owed the Templars fortunes, and he hated it. To him they weren't holy warriors, they were creditors he couldn't control, and Philip wasn't the kind of man to politely pay back what he owed. He was the kind of man to destroy his bankers instead. That's where the next chapter of this story begins. The fall of the Templars didn't come on the battlefield. It came in the shadows, through rumours, lies, and fire. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar seemed untouchable. They had the Pope's blessing, the trust of kings, and a reputation on the battlefield that made enemies tremble. But all the discipline, all the faith, all the castles and crosses in the world couldn't protect them from the thing that undoes so many powerful groups' debt, not their debt, someone else's. And that someone was King Philip IV of France. Philip looked every inch the part of a noble king. Tall, handsome, and dignified, he was nicknamed Philip the Fair. But behind the chiseled features was a man drowning in financial ruin. His wars against England and Flanders had emptied his treasury. He was bankrupt, desperate, and furious. And unfortunately for the Templars, they were his biggest creditors. Now, most kings in debt might tighten the belt, raise taxes, maybe sell off a few estates. But Philip wasn't most kings. Instead of paying back what he owed, he decided it would be cheaper to destroy the people holding the bill. And so, he hatched a plan that would take one of the most feared and respected orders in the world and reduce them to ashes. The first step was propaganda. Philip's men began spreading whispers, dark rumors that the Templars weren't what they seemed. People said the knights spat on the cross during their secret initiations, that they worshipped idols, maybe even the devil himself, that their vows of chastity weren't exactly being honored behind closed doors. None of it had proof. None of it mattered. In an age where superstition ran deep, rumor was as good as fact. But Philip couldn't do it alone. He needed the Pope. Luckily for him, he had one in his pocket. Clement V, a French pope with more loyalty to Philip than to Rome, became the perfect accomplice. Under Philip's pressure, Clement hesitated, resisted, but eventually gave in. And that's when the trap was sprung. On Friday, October 13, 1307, across France, soldiers stormed into Templar commanderies in one of the most coordinated mass arrests in history. At dawn, thousands of knights were dragged from their beds. Some were in armor, some in prayer, some still half asleep. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay himself was seized in Paris. The Templars, once God's fury on horseback, found themselves shackled and humiliated, accused of crimes they couldn't even comprehend. The torture that followed was brutal. Men were stretched on racks, burned with hot irons, their limbs crushed, their fingernails torn out. Under unbearable agony, They confessed to whatever their captors wanted to hear, that they denied Christ, that they kissed each other in secret, that they worshipped a severed head called Baphomet. These confessions, wrung out through pain and terror, became Philip's evidence. The trials were a spectacle. Knights who had once charged fearlessly into battle now stood broken in courtrooms, forced to admit to sins that made them sound like monsters. The public, shocked and horrified, began to believe the lies. And just like that, centuries of honor and sacrifice were undone by ink, fire and chains. But not everyone gave in. Jacques de Molay, after years in prison, finally had his say. On March 18, 1314, after 7 long years of captivity, he was brought out to be executed. Standing on a scaffold in Paris, with the flames rising around him, de Molay recanted his forced confession. He declared that the Templars were innocent. And then, with smoke choking his voice, he shouted a curse that both Philip and Clement would face judgment within the year. Legend has it the curse stuck. Clement died within a month. Philip collapsed suddenly later that same year. To the people of France, it felt like divine justice, the heavens answering the cries of a betrayed brotherhood. And from that moment on, Friday the 13th carried with it a shadow, a superstition born of that single morning when knights were seized and a legend began to die. But here's the twist: the Templars' bodies burned, yet their legend only grew. The fire that consumed them lit a new flame in history, one of mystery, conspiracy, and myth. Because while Philip seized much of their wealth, rumours spread that the real treasure had vanished. Some said it was the Holy Grail. Others swore it was the Ark of the Covenant. Some even believed the Templars had escaped by sea, carrying their secrets to Scotland or even the New World. The truth: most historians agree the treasure was more boring records, coin property that Philip quickly absorbed. But myths are always more powerful than ledgers. And so the Templars, destroyed by greed and lies, were reborn in the imagination as something more than mortal. Their fall is one of the greatest cautionary tales in history. No army defeated them. No battle crushed them. It was politics, ambition, and lies that brought them down. They were a state within a state, too powerful, too independent, and in the end, too tempting a target. But while Philip destroyed their bodies, he couldn't destroy their story. That's the strange thing about legends. They survive long after the people are gone. And in the centuries that followed, the Templars became larger than life. Heroes in some stories, villains in others, always cloaked in secrecy. And that's where we go next, from ashes to myth, from fact to fantasy. Because even though the Templars are gone, their shadow still lingers, and the treasure they supposedly left behind has haunted imaginations for over 700 years. When Jacques de Molay's voice echoed through the smoke of his execution, cursing Philip and Clement, it seemed like the last breath of the Knights Templar. Their order was dissolved, their leaders dead, their castles seized. But that was just the end of their bodies. Their legend had only just begun. Because once the flames died down, questions rose up, questions that have never really gone away. What happened to the treasure? For 2 centuries, the Templars had managed money, guarded wealth, and collected donations from across Christendom. They weren't flashy about it, but everyone knew they were rich. Too rich. When Philip's soldiers stormed their commanderies in 1307, they expected to find vaults overflowing with gold. And yet, when they cracked them open, there was nothing. Empty. The treasure had vanished. That single mystery has fueled 700 years of speculation. Some say the Templars spirited their wealth away in secret convoys, loading wagons under the cover of night, hiding gold and relics in places no king could reach. Others believe a fleet of Templar ships sailed from France before the arrests, vanishing into the mist and carrying their fortune to safety. Did they reach Scotland? Did they cross the ocean to the New World centuries before Columbus? Nobody knows, and that's what makes the story irresistible. Then come the relics. The whispers grow stranger. People claim the Templars weren't guarding gold at all, but something far more precious, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. sacred scrolls, even secrets about the bloodline of Christ. Each rumor builds on the last, layer after layer, until the line between history and legend is almost impossible to see. And because myths feed on silence, the Templars became fertile ground for imagination. They had always been secretive. Their initiation rituals were closed to outsiders. Their oaths were whispered in the dark. To common people, that secrecy was eerie, maybe even sinister. So when Philip accused them of bizarre practices, spitting on the cross, kissing one another in strange ceremonies, those accusations stuck, not because they were true, but because people already believed the order hid things from the world. Over time, those whispers morphed into grand conspiracies. Some said the Templars didn't die at all, but went underground, disguising themselves as stonemasons, blending into society, waiting. That legend is where the theories about them founding the Freemasons come from. Others argued they survived as hidden brotherhoods, steering history from the shadows. And as centuries rolled on, every time something mysterious happened, a revolution, a strange symbol carved in stone, a hidden vault, someone would point and say, "The Templars were here." Of course, history tells us most of their wealth didn't vanish into thin air. Philip seized what he could. The rest was absorbed into other orders, like the Hospitallers. The treasure wasn't a glittering chest of gold. It was ledgers, property, the steady flow of income from farms and rents. But let's be honest, that's boring. It doesn't spark the imagination. And so, people held on to the myth instead. Think about it. A fleet disappearing into the sea, a chest buried beneath a chapel, a secret that could shake the church to its core. That's the stuff stories are made of. And stories, unlike coins, don't fade. They grow. And grow they did. From medieval legends to modern pop culture, the Templars never really left us. They've been reimagined as guardians of holy relics, keepers of forbidden knowledge, or villains running shadowy empires. They show up in novels, movies, even video games. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code turned them into custodians of Christ's bloodline. The Assassin's Creed series painted them as a hidden cabal, pulling the strings of civilization. They've become a blank canvas for every conspiracy, every myth, every what if. That's the power of their story. They weren't just soldiers or bankers. They were symbols, and symbols never truly die. The red cross on a white mantle has outlived every king, every pope, every castle they ever built. It lingers in our imagination, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacies aren't carved in stone, but whispered in shadows. So, while the real Templars were destroyed by lies and fire, the mythical Templars became immortal. And maybe that's why their story still grips us. Because deep down, we all love a mystery. We all love the idea that somewhere out there, hidden beneath the earth or behind locked doors, lies a secret treasure waiting to be discovered. But while the Templars became legends, their fall also left behind a lesson: unchecked power, even holy power, is never safe from ambition. That truth echoed in stone too, in the heart of Paris, where another great symbol of medieval faith and power was rising, one that would face its own battles against time, fire, and revolution. Our next stop takes us to the story of a cathedral. Not just any cathedral, but the beating stone heart of Paris, Notre Dame. When you think of medieval Europe, you probably picture castles, knights, or maybe a king strutting around in a crown. But if there was one symbol that captured the ambition, faith, and artistry of the age, it wasn't a person at all. It was a building, rising out of the heart of Paris, built stone by stone over centuries. Notre Dame wasn't just a cathedral. It was a statement, a dream, a prayer carved into the sky. Let's rewind to the 12th century. Paris was on the rise, growing in wealth and influence, buzzing with merchants, scholars, and priests. The city needed a center that matched its ambition. Enter Bishop Maurice de Sully, who in 1160 had a vision, not of a simple church, but of a monument that would make people stop in their tracks, crane their necks, and feel small in the face of something holy. He wanted a cathedral so vast, so luminous, that it would outshine anything around it. And in 1163, construction began. Imagine the first stones being laid, no cranes, no machines, just muscle, rope, and sheer determination. Workers hauled massive blocks of limestone from nearby quarries, chiseling them by hand. They knew from the start they'd never see it finished. Fathers passed chisels to sons, who passed them to grandsons. Notre Dame wasn't just a building project. It was a generational commitment, a statement of faith stretched across time. As the walls rose, so did the problems. The vaulted ceilings were so high, the outward force of the heavy stone threatened to push the walls apart. In older Romanesque churches, architects solved this by making walls thick and windows small. But Notre Dame wasn't meant to be dark and heavy. It was meant to glow. So the builders came up with something revolutionary, the flying buttress. Picture it, stone arms arching from the cathedral's walls to solid piers outside, like wings bracing the building. These weren't just supports, they were poetry in stone. They carried the weight outward, allowing the walls to be thinner, the ceilings higher, the windows bigger. Suddenly, light poured in through massive stained glass. Reds, blues, and golds danced across the floor as sunlight passed through the rose windows. Step inside, and it wasn't just a building anymore. It was a vision of heaven. By the 1200s, Notre Dame dominated Paris. Its twin towers stood like sentinels above the city. Its facade, decorated with saints, kings, and gargoyles, told stories to people who couldn't read. For the illiterate masses, this wasn't just decoration. It was a picture book of salvation and judgment. Step through its doors, and you stepped into eternity. For centuries, Notre Dame wasn't just a church. It was the stage for France's biggest moments. Kings were crowned beneath its arches. Royal weddings echoed in its nave. Funeral bells tolled for the great and powerful. It was the beating heart of Paris, linking the crown to God in stone and glass. But like all symbols of power, Notre Dame also drew anger. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the cathedral was seen as a monument to monarchy and oppression. Revolutionaries stormed it, tearing down statues, smashing relics, and melting the bells into cannon. The Gallery of Kings, 28 stone figures carved into the facade, was decapitated because the mob thought they represented French monarchs. In truth, they were biblical kings, but nuance doesn't survive revolutions. Notre Dame was stripped bare, turned into a warehouse, even renamed the Temple of Reason. By the early 1800s, the cathedral was crumbling. Its spire dismantled, its windows shattered, its walls blackened with neglect. There were serious discussions about demolishing it altogether. Paris nearly lost its heart. And then came a book. In 1831, Victor Hugo published The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He didn't just write a story about Quasimodo and Esmeralda. He wrote a love letter to the cathedral itself, portraying it as a living character. Beautiful, wounded, misunderstood. The novel struck a chord. Suddenly, Parisians realized what they were about to lose. Outcry swept the city. People demanded restoration. In 1844, architect Hugues Viollet-le-Duc began a massive project to save Notre Dame. He rebuilt statues, repaired stone, and designed a new spire, taller, more ornate than the original. Gargoyles were added, staring down from dizzying heights, half grotesque, half Gaudian. Slowly, the cathedral regained its grandeur, and for over a century, it stood again as the soul of Paris. Notre Dame survived world wars. It survived the Nazi occupation. It survived centuries of storms, fires, and revolutions. But on April 15, 2019, the world held its breath as flames engulfed the roof. For hours, the cathedral burned. The spire collapsed in a shower of sparks. Smoke choked the Paris sky. Millions watched live, some in tears, as one of humanity's greatest treasures seemed to vanish before their eyes. And yet, just as it had before, Notre Dame endured. The stone towers held. The rose windows survived. Relics, including the crown of thorns, were carried to safety by firefighters who risked everything. Out of the ashes came a renewed promise Notre Dame would be rebuilt. And as of December 2024, after years of painstaking work, the cathedral reopened to the public. Once again, its bells rang out across Paris. Notre Dame isn't just a church, its resilience carved in stone. It has fallen and risen more than once. burned, defaced, abandoned, and saved. It reminds us that some symbols outlast time, politics, even fire. Step inside its walls, and you feel it. The weight of centuries, the stubbornness of faith, the unbreakable spirit of a city. But our journey tonight doesn't end in Paris. Because while Notre Dame was rising in Europe, far across the seas another legend was taking shape. Not in stone, but on the waves. This time, the crown wasn't on a king's head. It was in the hands of a woman who defied every expectation, commanded tens of thousands, and brought empires to their knees. Our final stop is the South China Sea, where the most successful pirate in history ruled not with mercy, but with strategy. Next up, the pirate queen Zheng Yi. When you think of a pirate, you probably picture a bearded man with a cutlass, maybe a parrot on his shoulder, shouting, "Ah," as his ship cuts through the waves. But history's most successful pirate wasn't a man at all. She was a woman from southern China, and her empire didn't just rival the great navies of Europe. It crushed them. Her name was Zheng Yi, and her story is so remarkable that it feels almost like legend, yet it's all true. She was born in 1775 in Guangdong province. Like so many poor girls of her time, her life began not in freedom but in survival. As a teenager, she worked on a flower boat, a floating brothel anchored off the coast. These boats were part of the harsh reality of 18th century China, where poverty pushed young women into exploitation. But Zheng Yi was no ordinary girl. She watched, she listened, she memorized faces and names. She learned how powerful men thought, how they boasted after too much wine, what they feared, what they wanted. She wasn't just surviving, she was taking notes. Then fate intervened. In 1801, a pirate lord named Zheng Yi visited her boat. He was a commanding figure, leader of the notorious Red Flag fleet. Struck by her intelligence and cunning, he didn't just want her as a wife, she demanded something in return: joint control of his fleet. Not as a concubine, not as a figurehead, but as an equal partner. And he agreed. It was an unheard of arrangement in that world, but Zheng Yi was already rewriting the rules. For 6 years they built their pirate empire together. Then, in 1807, Zheng Yi suddenly died, maybe in a storm, maybe in battle. Everyone assumed the empire would shatter. After all, who would follow a widow? Dozens of captains waited like vultures, ready to carve up the fleet. But Zheng Yi stepped forward, not with brute force, but with strategy. She seized control, consolidating power with stunning speed. To secure loyalty, she married Zheng Yi's adopted son and trusted lieutenant, Cheng Po Sai. Together, they created a partnership that blended military might with political shrewdness. Under her command, the Red Flag fleet didn't just survive, it exploded. Within a year, she commanded over 600 ships. Some estimates claim her forces eventually grew to nearly 1,800 vessels and 70,000 men. To put that in perspective, her pirate navy was larger than most national navies in Europe at the time. The South China Sea belonged to her, but she didn't rule by chaos. She ruled by law. Zheng Yi created one of the strictest pirate codes in history. Loot had to be presented to the fleet's treasury. Pirates kept 20%. The rest went into a communal fund. Anyone caught stealing from the common pot lost their head. If a pirate assaulted a female captive, he was executed immediately. Disobey an order in battle. Death. Desertion. Death. Her rules were brutal, but they were clear. Everyone knew where they stood. And because of that, her fleet functioned more like a disciplined navy than a gang of rogues. Her men weren't just loyal out of fear. They were loyal because her system worked. Victories were profitable. Life under her code, harsh as it was, often felt fairer than life under the corrupt Qing government. Even defeated rivals sometimes joined her, preferring her order to imperial rule. She divided the fleet into color-coded squadrons: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green. At the top, the Red Squadron, led by Cheng Po Sai, acted as her elite force. Together, they created a pirate confederation that stretched from Vietnam to Hong Kong, raiding trade routes, taxing coastal towns, and humiliating imperial officials. By 1808, the Qing dynasty could no longer ignore her. They sent their navy to crush the pirates. But time and again, Zheng Yisao outmaneuvered them. She used shallow waters to trap heavier warships. She ambushed fleets with perfect timing. She even captured enemy squadrons and folded their ships into her own. The Qing grew so desperate they begged the Portuguese and British to help. Imagine that, one woman commanding so much power that empires had to team up to fight her. And even then, she held them off. But Zheng Yisao wasn't just a warrior. She was a realist. She knew wars couldn't last forever. Her fleet was massive, but supplies were thinning. Men were growing restless. And while she was still undefeated, she saw the writing on the wall. Unlike most pirates who fought to the bitter end, she did something extraordinary. She negotiated. In 1810, she approached the Qing government, not as a supplicant, but as a leader. She demanded amnesty, not just for herself, but for her entire fleet. She insisted they keep their wealth. She asked that Cheng Po-tsai be given an official military post. The Qing, exhausted and humiliated, agreed. On April 18, 1810, Zheng Yisao sailed into the city with 200 ships and 17,000 pirates at her back. But instead of chains, she came in triumph. There were no mass executions, no confiscated treasures. Her men walked away free. Cheng Po-tsai became a naval officer, and Zheng Yisao retired, rich and untouchable. Think about that. Almost every pirate story ends in betrayal, death, or the gallows. Hers ended in victory. She walked away on her own terms, lived comfortably in Canton, ran a gambling house and an opium business, and died peacefully in 1844 at the age of 69. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a conqueror. Her story is often forgotten in the West, overshadowed by tales of Blackbeard or Captain Kidd. But none of them came close to her scale. She didn't just plunder ships, she ruled the sea. She didn't just defy a king, she forced an empire to kneel. And she did it in a world where women weren't supposed to lead anything, let alone tens of thousands of hardened sailors. Zheng Yisao didn't ask for a place at the table. She took the entire ocean. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that proves power doesn't care about gender, station, or expectation. It cares about strategy, discipline, and will. And so our journey tonight ends not in a castle or a cathedral, but on the deck of a ship under a red flag, with the sea stretching endlessly ahead. We've walked through the scandals of kings, the madness of rulers, the rise and fall of knights, the resilience of stone, and the triumph of a pirate queen. Together we've seen how history is shaped not just by battles and treaties, but by the flawed, passionate, and often outrageous lives of the people who lived it. So as you settle deeper into your pillow, maybe closing your eyes now, let the waves carry you, let the stories linger like echoes, and remember, history isn't just about facts on a page, it's about people. Messy, complicated, unforgettable people who left behind stories worth telling.